Hi everyone. So I want to do a talk about this guy called Friedrich Nietzsche. His name, excuse me, a little hard to spell, sometimes hard to pronounce, I guess. But I wanted to talk about him in relationship to what we saw in Camus, because his influence over Camus and pretty much the 20th century is immense. In his lifetime, he was not very well known up until the last years of his life. So you can see here that he died at 56. He lived from 1844 to 1900. And his ideas at the time were basically ignored because nobody knew who he was. Um, he spent famously the last 10 years of his life basically insane. So around 1890, he lost his mind, quite literally, and was essentially an invalid. As you can see here in this ridiculous drawing, he is very famous for his mustache. If you actually go and look at some of the photographs of him, his mustache when he was younger was not quite as ridiculous. His sister, who was taking care of him after he lost his mind, kind of groomed him in this almost absurd fashion, this kind of hyperbolic fashion, to play up the drama of Nietzsche. So he was born in Germany. He was heavily, I mention him here because I think that Schopenhauer is actually a really funny, profound thinker, but he was heavily influenced by this guy named Arthur Schopenhauer. So if you have a chance, if you ever get bored, you can always go read some Schopenhauer. Nietzsche's, these are some of his books. He's got a couple more. These are not chronological either. Some of his books include The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, Ecce Homo, which means behold the man or behold the person. You might have heard this phrase before. This was, I think, it's in one of the Gospels. It's translated out of the Greek into the Latin. It's what Pontius Pilate says when they bring out Jesus after he's been basically flayed. And he says, Ecce Homo, which, like I said, means behold the man. His book, Will to Power, is actually still a pretty good read. This book was not directly written by him. He wrote drafts of it, and it was later put together by his sister. I'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later. We have Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is actually a really fun book to read when you're young. I have not revisited it for quite a while, but it's a fun book based on this character Zarathustra, who's intended to parallel Jesus in a sense, and it's based on kind of Zoroastrian principles. Then his book, The Gay Science, that gay there does not mean homosexual, rather it means the other definition, happy. So, Nietzsche is basically a philosopher of motivations. If we think back to, or if you think back to, like Socrates, right? Socrates, when we looked at some of the things he was talking about in Plato, he was constantly asking questions about why people believe the things that they believe. Okay? How do we know that we know that something is true or something is valuable or something is good? All of those kinds of aspects. Socrates and Plato by default really did believe that there was an answer to those questions, that we could arrive at least a sufficient answer to these kinds of definitions what is courage, what is beauty, etc., such that we could use that as a prompt to further more social engagement, more questions, even, etc. Nietzsche was heavily influenced, especially by the character Socrates. Like I said, it's really kind of hard to discern where Plato begins and where Socrates begins and ends, and where Plato begins and ends. Like I said, Socrates never wrote anything down, so we can't identify which ideas are more Socrates than Plato. But anyway, Socrates had a kind of Nietzsche had a love-hate relationship with Socrates. He absolutely adored the ideas that Socrates espoused. What he did not like was Socrates's piety, you might say, to the city or to the laws. So in that scene, when Socrates drinks the hemlock, succumbs to the democratic will, the judgment of his peers, Nietzsche sees that as a kind of betrayal of the very things that Socrates was discussing. So there's a kind of love-hate relationship in that. But what I said about Nietzsche earlier, this idea of Nietzsche as a philosopher of motivations. What drives us to do the things that we do? Now, you can see this theme come up in Camus, okay? To be self-conscious of our motivations, to be self-aware of the things that we find important, we find valuable, right? Those for Camus help to drive our responsibility. And so for existentialism itself, responsibility, choice, personal responsibility, these things become super important, okay? So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at two of Nietzsche's most famous pronouncements, okay? Most people know some of his famous sayings, Nietzsche's. But most people don't really know a lot about him. So before we get into that, I kind of want to discuss just a few pieces of his life, a few pieces of, these misconceptions that people have about him, because I remember being even maybe 10 years old and kind of hearing the name. And this is odd because where I grew up, we weren't, I grew up in the middle of the country, in basically rural America. But he was kind of a figure that was common to talk about, however, not common to actually go and read. So there were a lot of misconceptions about Nietzsche himself. Now, one of the things that comes up is, was Nietzsche crazy? Actually, no. Like I said, he spent the last 10 years of his life, he totally lost his mind. And I think that it was a combination of poor health, just stress in general. He was really trying to get his mind around human motivations. When he says beyond good and evil, he means that we have to get beyond those categories for assigning good versus evil to actions and or deeds. He wanted to kind of create this new morality for his time. And so I think that just created a lot of mental stress. There is a suggestion that he also was sick with syphilis. And as you know, syphilis is a degenerative disease if not treated. And so at that time, penicillin did not exist, so this disease might have gone unchecked, and it eventually will start to affect the spinal column and brain. I think that combination of things. There's a famous story that when he was in Turin, Turino, I'll write that out here. Where's my cursor? Sorry. Wrong cursor. So he was in Turin in Italy, and he saw a man beating a horse. So this horse was drawing a wagon or something. It was very heavy, and the horse, maybe it was too old, couldn't pull the weight of this wagon. So the carriage driver was beating this horse, and Nietzsche ran up to the horse, embraced it, and said, "I understand you," and then collapsed, and thereafter basically lost his mind. And I think if we try to understand this from a human perspective, I think we see that Nietzsche was such a sensitive person that even acts of cruelty toward some brute animal were they affected him very deeply. And when we expand that out into the human realm and we think, how is it that human beings can treat each other so horribly and yet so wonderfully at times? And I think that is a very telling kind of incident in his life. To just watch this animal being savagely beaten and then finding sympathy and empathy with it, and then that being the final straw, the thing that broke him. He, excuse me, like I said, he was a very actually polite and quiet person. This is actually a very well-known fact about him. In his writings, he seems very bombastic. He uses a lot of exclamation points. He talks about life and living and all of this, and yet, if you actually ever were to have met him, he would have been very polite, probably quite quiet. He spent most of the later years of his life moving around, especially in Switzerland, from boarding house to boarding house where he would write. He was physically very sick. He had terrible eyesight. He had terrible digestion, terrible stomach problems. I think I've read that for the latter part of his life, he basically just drank water. Like he couldn't really stomach anything more than water. He had to take a lot of drugs to diminish the pain in his stomach. As I said, he contracted syphilis. This is probably from his first and only sexual encounter, which we guess was at a brothel. Okay, so he was a very reclusive person. Now, there are some quotes that Nietzsche made about women that are less than polite. So some people will label him as a misogynist. I think that those accusations are they're not valid in my opinion, but they're not inaccurate. I think you can look at some of his writings and see that he didn't have a very favorable view of women, but that was probably largely because of his upbringing. His father died when he was young. His father was a pastor. Nietzsche was raised in a highly religious family, and he was raised essentially by his mother and his aunts. And so they were not very kind. They were not very nice people. And so I think that had a kind of lasting effect on him. But Nietzsche did at one point say that we should take the desires and the ideas of women from their own points of view and take them seriously. Okay? He was opposed, in fact, to the feminist goals that were going around in his time, this would have been what we call first wave feminism. He was opposed to them because, as he says, that their intention was to make women like men, not so much equal to, but to make them similar to men. And he said, well, why would you want to aspire to be like a man? They're ridiculous. And so his opposition to almost every kind of structure was uniform. And if you go and read him, you can see that he is very consistent in his opposition to structures, to organizations, to people or ideas that claim to have the final answer. And so you can kind of see his affinity there to the figure of Socrates. You know, what is courage? What is justice? What is love? What is beauty? Why do you believe the things that you believe? Okay. Now, Nietzsche was what we would call, I'll write this out here, what we'd call an anti-foundationalist. Okay, so that opposition to structure, to the idea of there being a final truth and all of that, this is where he diverges from Socrates. He is an anti-foundationalist. He would say that basically there is no capital T truth. There are only subjective truths, okay, for each individual. And so you can see there the influence of Nietzsche on Camus. Okay, Camus would say that the meaning of life is the meaning that you give to life by living a full or genuine life. Okay, there is no, excuse me, there is no outside perspective that is going to grant you meaning in your own life. So you can see the influences starting to show up here between Camus and Nietzsche. Nietzsche was famously anti-religious, and I would put it like this. I think he was anti-religion. Okay, he actually had some very nice things to say about Jesus, the figure of Jesus. He actually really did not like Paul, okay, because Paul, in Nietzsche's mind, interpreted or misinterpreted Jesus's message. Okay. So for him, once again, you can see that anti-foundationalism really showing up. He basically just did not like organized religion. He thought that it made people lazy, and he thought that it made them lazy intellectually. Okay, because the answer was already there. It didn't require any self-seeking, or it didn't require any self-investigation. Excuse me. Nietzsche saw life as a struggle. Oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Some people think that Nietzsche was anti-Semitic. Once again, he had no problem with Jewish people. He just did not like organized religion. The Nazis, much later, after he died, famously kind of took up some of his ideas, and therefore, or thereafter, his name has been associated with Nazism. That couldn't be further from the truth. His sister, in fact, and her husband were anti-Semites. They were anti-Semitic. You can almost call them proto-Nazis. And so they were kind of responsible for trying to push his work toward the ideas espoused by the Nazis. Nietzsche would have hated this. He would have totally denounced all things anti-Semitic. He hated anti-Semitism. So, like I said, Nietzsche saw life as a struggle, but he said that as individuals, we must intervene in our own lives to make our lives better. Okay? We must examine our lives and live outwardly. We must accept life. We have to struggle against death. Okay? And that is the main message. Okay, we have to have the will, okay, the willpower to will ourselves to want more, to do more, etc. Okay, we can't be passive in our own lives. There's one more thing that I need to get rid of as far as Nietzsche goes. Some people see him as what we call a nihilist. That is to say that there is no meaning. Okay, nothing means anything. Nietzsche was not a nihilist. If you go and read him, you can see that it's clearly not true. He's talking about embracing life and taking it very seriously and loving it for all of its joys and imperfections. And you'll see this here in a minute with his little parable called The Heaviest Weight. Okay, we'll read this here in a minute. And then we'll look at the death of God. Okay, so these are two of his more famous bits of writing. He wrote quite a bit. And so I want to kind of look at these and hopefully tease out some of the thematic relationships to Camus' work so that you can draw upon Nietzsche as a secondary source in your final paper. So you can draw upon Nietzsche as another source to support whether you think, Camus was right or Kierkegaard was right. Okay, Nietzsche would have been a kind of contemporary of Kierkegaard. So I'm going to blow this up here. So I'm going to read this to you. If you need to find this text, you can look on I believe I gave the citation reference on Moodle, or you can just go to Google. You can type in Nietzsche, heaviest weight, and then Walter Kaufmann, who was the translator. Now, in this piece, what Nietzsche is discussing is his idea that he called eternal recurrence. Okay. Once again, the idea here is self-creation and self-consciousness. Now, that idea of self-consciousness is paramount for Camus, right? So you can see how Camus is reading Nietzsche very carefully and very seriously in order to develop his own ideas that we saw in the selection from Myth of Sisyphus. So this is Nietzsche. This is from his book, The Gay Science. The heaviest weight. What if some day or night, excuse me, what if some day or night a demon, now here he means demon more as like a spirit, okay? He doesn't mean it in the strict Christian sense. In fact, our word demon comes from the Greek word daimon, which simply means like spirit, or kind of how to put it, almost like a supernatural kind of force, okay, that might motivate somebody. So that's where our word demon comes from. But Socrates very often would refer to his daimon, okay, which is to say the voice in his head which would ask him questions. What if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once again and innumerable times again. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unspeakably small or great in your life must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? If this thought gained power over you, as you are, it would transform and possibly crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you want this again and innumerable times again, would lie on your actions as the heaviest weight? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to long for nothing more fervently than for this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal? Now, it can be a little confusing when you get into the weeds of this, because what he's talking about, as I said, is this idea of eternal recurrence. This was, I think it was more of a philosophical, more like a philosophical thought experiment, okay? So the idea is this. Here's where your life begins, okay, at birth. And then you go around, right? And then there's death, okay? So imagine all the pains and joys. You have your childhood, your adolescence, early adulthood, all of this, right? Think of all of the pain. Let's go down. All the pain, joy, pain, joy, pain, joy, pain, joy, pain, joy. Over and over and over and over, right? Because let's be honest, that's kind of what life is, right? Now imagine all of those choices that you made that caused either pain or joy, right? Imagine now you had to relive it all over again. Now when you are born again, okay, you aren't conscious of these things. You don't know that they're coming. Now at this moment X, let's call it, or let's call it Y, because we have X up here. Let's call it moment Y. Here comes this demon. Okay, you're sitting at your desk, you're lonely, you're sad, you're depressed, whatever. You're having an existential moment, right? Maybe you're a crisis of faith or something. Why? Where? What am I doing with my life? Okay, and here comes this little demon. Okay, and he says to you, or she, or whatever. Okay, everything you do from now on, you are going to have to relive this. Now, up until this point, it wasn't your fault, was it? You didn't know. You weren't aware of it. Demon comes in. He says, everything after this, you are going to have to relive again and again and again. Now, for Nietzsche, this is where you can see the overlaps with Camus. He says that wouldn't that motivate you to start making better choices, right? To live your life more honestly, fully, completely, right? To turn the TV off, go outside and experience the world, life, even when you waste time. It's a self-conscious waste of time, you see. And so hereafter, right, all of the joys, pains, joy, pain, all of those things are now your responsibility because you are now self-aware of it. Okay. Now Nietzsche I don't think he really believed that this what was true, but what he's talking about is taking responsibility for your own life because nobody else is going to do that for you, right? Once you become aware of the things that you value, now you see Socrates' influence there, right? Why do you value the things that you value? Okay, you see Camus' relationship to Nietzsche, the idea of being self-conscious of yourself and your own life, to take responsibility for the choices that you make, even the mistakes, right? to see even mistakes as something to learn from, to take from those a valuable lesson. So Nietzsche wants us to live our lives creatively, to live them beautifully. Okay? He doesn't want a perfect life. He's not calling upon people to be perfect because who knows what that even means. What he's actually asking is that we live a beautiful life. Okay? He wants us to live life almost like art. Okay? To make it beautiful, to make it an aesthetic thing. Okay. Um, Now, like I said, one of the kind of ironies of this is that Nietzsche was very ill. He was constantly sick, right? He was physically very, very ill. Um, but in his writing, he talks about health and strength and living this beautiful life. So you can see him, even though he can't do it physically, he can do it through his writing. Okay. Um, Now, like I said, how would you know up until this point, where the demon comes in, that you were supposed to be living a beautiful life? Well, there's no way to know. Okay? There's no way for you to know. But upon Nietzsche asking you that question, think of Nietzsche, okay? The demon here, give him a mustache. The demon here is really Nietzsche, right? Coming and talking to you. He says, okay, now that you've read this, now that you have read this passage, now isn't it your responsibility to try to live more genuinely, to try to live more responsibly, to make better mistakes, as Samuel Beckett, the Irish playwright, said, to fail better, right? Because you've learned from your mistakes in the past, okay? Now, Nietzsche does not offer us an ethical system, okay? What he's offering is a personal challenge to each individual, because for each one of you, Nietzsche would argue, it's not like I can come in and say, okay, if you read more philosophy, you're going to be a better person. Because for some people, that's just not going to work, right? It'd be the same as if I came in and said, well, you'd be a better person if you went and read the Quran, or the Bible, or the Bhagavad Gita, or the Mahabharata, or the Upanishads, or the Book of Mormon. You know, so each one of those books, I mean, I've read them, and I've learned quite a bit from them. But if I or anyone comes in and says, this is the way that you need to live, okay, Nietzsche would argue that that violates the aesthetic life, the value of each person finding in their life the things that give it meaning. Okay. Now, sometimes that does come from faith or philosophy or heck, even ice cream, right? But it's about being self-aware of that thing and why you value it, and why you value yourself, and why you value life, this life, you see. And that's what Nietzsche really challenges us to do, and I think in a really beautiful way. You can see in this passage over here just the beauty in his writing. I mean, it's a beautiful passage, right? Where this demon is talking, and everything unspeakably small or great in your life must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider, it's almost as if the demon is gesturing into the room, pointing to a little spider, to the trees outside. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. Right? It's just a beautiful little piece of writing. So you can see in this, though, this call to self-actuation, self-realization, the understanding or self-understanding of what are the things that you value, not what Nietzsche values, but what you value. The self-conscious awareness, like Camus wants us to do, the self-conscious awareness of um, our own lives in order to live more genuinely, in order to live more fully, in order to live more clearly. So I'm going to put up two of these videos side by side here, and we'll talk next about Nietzsche's other famous piece called The Madman. Okay, so I'm just going to cut this up so we don't, I think half an hour chunks are usually pretty much ideal. So I will be back in a moment. Thank you.